Okay, so let's turn to some of the big stuff that moves us toward the American Revolution. So, since we are doing like cultural history, a lot of this is just trying to lay the groundwork on some of the other future movements, and also to kind of give a background, since we are going to be diving into the relationship between the founding fathers coming up. So, a lot of historians will talk about the philosophical background of the United States, from the 13 colonies onward. The big idea here is um, the Calvinist Puritan background. So the idea of like leaving England for religious freedom, versus, or not really versus, but more along, coming along with the European Enlightenment. So European Enlightenment is, well, let's go back. So Calvinism is a form of Protestantism that that's there, coming out of the Protestant Reformation in the early and 16th century, and it made inroads into the English world. And the idea behind Calvinism is this belief in God's grace. God gives grace to sinful humanity freely, but God is in complete sovereign control of this. So God basically chooses from what Calvinist theologians would call the elect. So this is a very providential, deterministic view of history, right? That some are chosen by God to be um, God's special people on the world, and there's nothing special. There's nothing special about the people in of themselves. Everybody's a sinner, but that God, out of God's own grace and wisdom, saves some. So that's kind of the belief of Puritanism. One way you choose you show your election is by being spirit. Well, you're a spiritual person. You're somebody who's striving to be um, morally upright, raise a good family. The basic, you would call maybe kind of Western modern morality. So you have that on the one hand, and then you have the European Enlightenment ideas of like that it's through reason that you come up with knowledge first and foremost, or that you get to test things, right? That you have the freedom to use your senses to test your hypothesis. So give science the freedom to operate. Um, and Obviously within this world of the late 17th century and throughout the 18th century, these are mostly philosophers, intellectuals who are somewhat tired of the church in particular, because we're talking Western Europe. They're tired of the church kind of saying like, "Oh, you can't go there, you can't do that with science. You have to limit its freedom." So the Enlightenment is kind of a celebration of intellectual freedom and the rise of like political democracy, or the modern credo of, like you see with John Locke, life, liberty, and property. I mean, that's basically the makeup of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. So so that's another aspect of it. Um, Furthermore, the American situation is different in some ways to what's going on in what we would call now Latin America. You've read about this in Takaki, where the the rise of this English class is starting to settle on the East Coast. The incorporation of indentured servitude, servitude, um, along with African slavery, and then also the violence being enacted both to and from among indigenous groups, kind of makes for a very interesting and different mix in North America versus South America. If you think like the stuff we watched last week, indigenous peoples aren't really incorporated into what we know of as the United States. Um, and there's a very much more standoffish relationship as opposed to like what you see like in Latin America, where you get more of that mestizo mixedness identity, and quite a development of racial caste system in across Latin America, in Spanish territory. You don't really have that in North America. And instead, you do have this what some would call the so-called like white black binary development, where we think about most American history, and when you do talk about things like race, it oftentimes gets captured within that either or. Um, and some see, you know, the beginning of uh, of slavery as an aspect of that. You see it with Bacon's Rebellion, where you start to get distinction between African slaves and Irish and others as servants. Um, and this freedom of movement that is so key to all the way back at Plymouth in 1620, and key to like you know the settlement of English families now. Um, Even after the 7 Years' War, which is technically the first like global war featuring a number of European countries, but mostly between England and France. The Once the war is over, um, the English state is way more involved in their colonies, thus limiting that kind of openness and freedom that was so celebrated among the colonists. And then once they felt the kind of second class citizenship of being English colonists versus being English citizens, that connects to that whole idea of no taxation without representation. Um, because now, after the 7 Years' War, the English are now much more focused on the colonies and of reaping the benefits of the colonies, at least in paying back debt and raising taxes. And so that initiates. So if you think about the ideas of the European Enlightenment already growing in the 18th century, um, this is why ideas like life, liberty, and property are going to be such a big deal for the American founders. Um, okay, all right. So just trying to take a quick look at the Revolution. Um, so it's this sense of limitations and second class citizenry that sparked the American Revolution. Again, one of the big things was that line that divided the 13 colonies from quote unquote Indian territory, as the British had distinguished. The colonists, even with the line, the colonists are moving there. They're also doing, they're doing they're operating life. They've been operating life in the American colonies for about 100 years now, and now all of a sudden the English are coming in, kind of dictating the terms, and they didn't appreciate it. So, and so this is what initially leads to some of the backlash. Um, the war begins actually in 1775, and it begins in two battles at Lexington and Concord. Before that time period, the Bostonians, more than anybody else, had been really pushing against the British forces in their land. And so, long story short, this then leads to the 13 colonies, at least representatives from the 13 colonies, to kind of get together and, you know, discuss coming together and pushing against pushing for independence. And obviously, these are all then become part of the beginning American history, and this nationalist the story about the rise of the U.S. I do think what's helpful for some of us, especially if you grew up in the United States, and you're so used to this story and the label of quote unquote American exceptionalism oftentimes gets thrown here. But if you think about that narrative, this idea of like, well, the United States did this, and it's this kind of exceptional history. It is to some extent. So let's look at the on the one hand. So on the one hand, you have someone like Washington, who for all his faults, um, he's picked because he's one of the tallest guys in the room. He's picked because he does have experience in the 7 Years' War. He's picked because he's kind of a guy who's kind of risen up in Virginian high society. He has a large um, moral victory at the end of 1776, the year of independence. This is where he crossed the Delaware, and that's been kind of mythologized. After that point, he basically is trying to survive with the kind of ragtag group of soldiers that he has. But they do really take on battle style of the frontier against the British, who in some ways the British have an ocean separating them. The British do have a lot of loyalists that support support them here. They do have a number of African slaves that have mobilized to their side, promises of freedom. So you have this kind of weird mix. And in some ways, people will say the British lost because of their generals were just not up to the job. Um, Eventually, the war ends at the beginning of the 1780s, um, principally because Washington is able to kind of keep his forces alive. They're able then to enlist the French, who want payback against the British. So they're able to bring the French in, and the French are able, with the Americans, to corner Cornwallis at Yorktown and thus force his surrender. So that makes quick work of the British. Now, again, for all the, I think even in Takaki to some extent, the criticisms of the United States, even at its founding, one has to understand this is relatively new um, system. This is a Democrat republic. Within a few years, they will then, Alexander Hamilton and the whole like Hamilton like phenomenon has happened lately. There is something special about the Constitutional Convention at the end of the 1780s, and this system of government that's placed in with obvious checks and balances over the three branches of government, and even with this type of what's called federalism, this type of government that has both state power and national power. The big thing that's different that led to the Constitutional Convention was the necessity of having a strong national power, and we'll talk more about this when you're reading the Founding Fathers. But when the state starts off, um, you can look at the notes here. You can definitely see those that are voting are mostly propertied men, and we're obviously talking about English colonists. We're talking about European men, white men. So propertied European men. So we're talking, upper middle class, upper class men who are running the government. And that's how it's set up at the beginning. We'll see it change over time, and that's kind of one of the things we can focus on. Why did it take so long to do this? Why it takes so long to do that? I do think, again, this is the only place in the world that's really doing this in the whole world. If you want to compare it to the French Revolution that follows, that one is way more radically democratic, at least as it develops. But it also, leads into the bloody terror and people having their heads chopped off. The kind of system eats itself, and then it leads to a dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte, who then tries to like create an empire in Europe. So I do think there is lessons to learn here about the system of compromise, and that in some ways you look at the revolutions that get sparked in Haiti, Mexico, and the South American ones. that seems to be an offspring of the U.S. Revolution.